You're one of the founders of Go1, a co-founder of Black Sky Industries.
Instead of getting a job at McDonald's, we decided to register a business name. We spent 10 years wandering the desert to try and figure out what we wanted to do. Go1 was the opportunity to have an even greater impact at scale. Doing what you do, you've got to love doing it. And part of loving doing it, I think, is it has to have impact in some way or form. The main meal was building a company. The fries and the side dishes was going to universities. The question you need to ask is, how do I do this? Go1 was all of our first children. We collected credit cards. We literally had like a baseball sort of sleeve. We had to go through what I call wandering the abyss in the wilderness. Do you intend to swing for the fences, or do you want to build a lifestyle business? I really am not made for the corporate world. What we focus on is something called solid rocket motors. Young men die for what old men want to do.
This is Mark Publikowski, and welcome to the TechMates podcast, where my partner Henrik and I explore how Kiwi and Aussie founders are reshaping the future and what sets them apart. Henrik and I have been part of successful companies in Silicon Valley and Europe, and now bring that expertise to partner with entrepreneurs in Australasia. By sharing the personal stories of successful Kiwi and Aussie founders and how they got here, we hope to inspire you to dream big. This is TechMates, bringing an outsider's perspective to the stories of those daring to disrupt down under. Let's dive in.
Thank you so much for joining us on TechMates.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks,
Awesome. Vu, you're one of the founders of Go1, a co-founder of Black Sky Industries, exciting new venture that we want to talk about. But as always, we want to start with your upbringing. So I understand your parents came to Australia from Vietnam, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I like to tell people I'm incredibly lucky. I was born here in Australia 10 years after my parents arrived as refugees with my three older siblings. So I'm the youngest in my family by 10, 12, and 14 years.
Wow.
Siblings used to joke and tell me that I was the accident of the family. But ultimately, what it really comes back to is that, I've grown up, I'm second generation Vietnamese. My parents came here as refugees. They've been the beneficiaries of the prosperity that a country like Australia brings. I've been the beneficiary of the bravery and the willingness of my parents to flee their country after the Vietnam War, go to a refugee camp in Thailand, and eventually via the UN program come to Australia and settle in Australia. So for me, I grew up here 10 years after they arrived. I grew up in the 90s in Australia, the best time in human history, right? Post-Berlin War, pre-September 11, I grew up in the 90s in Australia where, life was pretty damn good. And so for me, I was very lucky. I went to a great high school where I met two of my co-founders from Go1, Chris and Andrew. Andrew is my best mate, and we've been good friends since we were young teenagers. Chris Akeland was in a year below us, and we became really good friends and started what eventually became Go1 together. I met my wife there in high school as well. Andrew met his wife there. So, I've been really lucky to be able to grow up in Australia, in the world that I grew up in, off the back of the hard work of my parents. And that really set me up to do everything from go to medical school and become a doctor and become a general practitioner, grow Go1 with my closest friends, and now do what I get to do in Black Sky today.
Amazing. Cool. Maybe double clicking on your childhood a little bit. So growing up in a kind of immigrant household, you said your parents were working really hard. Did they ever kind of talk about what it was like to flee Vietnam and start a new life in Australia?
Hugely. They were my bedtime stories. So, growing up as a kid, I used to say to mum and dad, and I still remember, I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old now. And when I was 6, I still remember saying to mum and dad, tell me the story of the night you fled Vietnam, the night that you got 14 people on dad's fishing boat and you fled for 2 days and 2 nights to get to a refugee camp in Thailand. Now, I don't know the exact numbers, but something like 2 million people fled Vietnam and about 700,000 people made it. So you had a 1 in 3 chance of actually surviving and getting there. Now, growing up, I grew up in a household that was incredibly entrepreneurial. And I thank my mum and dad for really, drumming that into me, because I grew up in a time, and I don't know what it's like in New Zealand where you guys are, but, you meet a Vietnamese migrant from my parents' generation. They owned a restaurant, a convenience store, a takeaway store, a sewing factory, something like that. It's funny. My dad, I remember explaining this to me once, and he said, the Steve Jobs of his generation, or the Bill Gates or the Elon Musk of his generation, fled Vietnam after the war. Because when refugees flee countries, it's usually the risk takers who flee, right? If you think about my dad, who was 25, 26 at the time, his 22-year-old wife, and their 3 young children under the age of 5, to put them all on a fishing boat and to go 2 days and 2 nights, knowing that you've got a 1 in 3 chance of survival. Man, they are risk takers, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this real selection bias, I believe, that migrants have. because to uplift yourself and move to a brand new country, you already have a bias towards taking a risk and chasing opportunities. And so as a result of that, I grew up in a very large family here in Brisbane, in Queensland, here in Australia, where, I have a massive family where my aunties and uncles, my mum and dad all owned businesses of some sort, right? And so growing up in a household where my parents owned a convenience store, a corner store, where I would wake up as a 5, 6, 7-year-old, go to the shop with dad, push the milk, stock the shelves. A customer would take me to school. I'd come back after school, work in the shop. If you needed to buy a packet of cigarettes, I was the one who was selling it to you at the corner store. If you were under the age of 18, as a 7 or 8-year-old, my job was to check your ID to make sure you were over the age of 18. At night, my job was to balance the till, count the money, do the FPOS, all those sorts of things. So, I grew up in a household where dealing with money and running a business was normal. And so when it came to time to high school, when everyone was getting a job at Woolworths or at McDonald's, I wrote a business plan and said to Andrew, let's build websites and let's sell websites to people. And so instead of getting a job at McDonald's, we decided to register a business name, and sort of the rest becomes history, if you will.
But you decided to go to medical school, right? Just after high school?
Yeah. So, myself, Andrew, Chris, it's like a bad joke, right? A doctor, a lawyer, an economist, and an engineer get together to start an education technology company, right? Between all four of us, we have completely different and diverse backgrounds in terms of the fields of study we decide to pursue. But the commonality between all four of us was a genuine love of learning, a curiosity about learning. And so, despite having very different backgrounds, there were probably 3 things that we knew. 1 was that we loved technology. 2 was that we loved education. And 3 was that we loved working together. So that ability to work with your best mates, to focus on something in tech and really have something like learning be the fundamental pillar of what powers your business, it was a bit of a no-brainer. And I'd like to say that we woke up one morning and we said, yes, we are going to build the world's largest aggregator of workplace learning to train corporates. But as 16, 17-year-olds, that is not what we woke up doing. We had no idea what we were doing. Like any great startup, we spent 10 years wandering the desert to try and figure out what we wanted to do. And we graduated high school in 2006, but we didn't go through Y Combinator till 2015. So almost a decade of wandering the desert to figure out what it is that we wanted to do before we actually got into a position when we go, online learning, building out for businesses is the opportunity that no one else was targeting at the time. And was our blue ocean to go and tackle and take on.
And why'd you go into medicine?
Why'd I go through medicine? So the answer is that we were all doing our uni degrees. So, I like to say to people that we started our first business before I went into medicine. Medicine was a bit of a side quest at the same time, right? I think we started our startups before.
For most people, it's the main quest.
It's the main quest. Well, it's more so one of those things where, people will turn around and say, Mark Zuckerberg, was able to build Facebook and he dropped out of university or college, and Bill Gates or whoever else is the same. Our thing is, how do we be successful and go to university and learn? And remember, we love education, right? It's not about the qualifications, it's about the ability to learn. And for me personally, it's about the ability to do something that's impactful. And, I come from a family of doctors. My sister and my brother are doctors. And for me, I can't think of anything much more impactful than being a doctor. But the flip side of what I learned is that being a doctor, it's very difficult to have impact at scale. So at Go1 today, in terms of the online learning space, 3 people every second are learning something via Go1, which means in the hour that we'll be talking, we'll probably deliver training to about 10,000 people. Now that's impact at scale. And I could never do that as a doctor working day in, day out, right? So I still practice medicine. On Sunday, I went and saw my patients, and on Thursday, I'll go see my patients. And I've had those patients for over 10 years, right? But the thing that it comes back to for me is that medicine was one of those opportunities to sort of do something that I genuinely enjoyed or thought was genuinely important. Crazily enough, Go1 was the opportunity to have an even greater impact at scale, which I think is very important. And for me, I think there's 2 things: doing what you do. And now I have kids, it's even more important. Doing what you do, you've got to love doing it. And part of loving doing it, I think, is it has to have impact in some way or form. And that's really been the focus in terms of what we do.
So you went off, became a doctor after university, and this whole time throughout university while you're getting your medical degree, you guys are exploring the opportunity for EdTech online.
We built websites, we built applications for people. We were a professional services company early on. So we would build you apps and websites. So this is probably grade 11. So 2005 to say 2014, we did everything.
So you were like studying during the day, and then in the evenings you'd be like coding up websites?
No, we'd be selling websites and building stuff during the day and then studying at night. It's the other way around, right? Like the main meal was building a company. The fries and the side dishes was going to university is the way that I describe it, right? You know, where some people were going out partying and traveling, you know, doing backpacking across Europe, we were building a company. And when some founders were sort of spending time, their downtime, you know, doing other things, I was studying, right? And so was Andrew, and so was Chris, and so was Chris. So I think what it really came back down to is that a core principle of how we approach problems, and I'll share this with you into the insight of how we operate as founders in Go1, is, Mark, Hendrik, when you run into a problem, sometimes you might ask yourself, can I do this, right? And I put it to you that is the wrong question to ask. The question you need to ask is, how do I do this? Can I will usually have a binary answer, yes or no. How do I has one answer, yes, and this is how we're going to do it, right? And so the question of how do we build Go1 and do medical school or economics or whatever it might be, right? That's the question, not can we. Because if can we, then you immediately shut your options down to a yes or a no, right? The other thing that it comes down to is I'm the schmuck in my team. I've really got to share this with you, right? Chris Aegland, while, you know, he's the CEO of Go1, he's now the CEO of Go1. He, while we're doing this, became Australia's youth ambassador to the United Nations. He's addressed the United Nations twice on Australia's innovation policy by youth. And that was back when we were in university. And while we're in university, I don't know if you guys remember in the 2000s, there was an earthquake in Haiti, right? He founded a charity called the School Bag Program and went to Haiti, lived in Haiti for a year and sent 10,000 school bags across to Haiti, right? And helped them rebuild their education system, right? Or helped their education system. And then he addressed the United Nations a few times. And then just after we finished YC, he was given the opportunity to clerk for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of South Africa as their international advisor. So if you ever wonder why Go1 has a Johannesburg office, that's why, right?
Interesting.
Andrew Barnes, he's a Rhodes Scholar, right? So while we were in university, he calls me up one day and he says, "Hey, Vu, I got a Rhodes Scholarship." And I said, "Awesome. What the hell is a Rhodes Scholarship?" So I had to Google what a Rhodes Scholarship was. And I was like, "You got to go to Oxford to get a Rhodes Scholarship. So does that mean you got to go to the UK?" He said, "Yeah." And it's like, okay. So if you wonder why Go1 has a London office, now you know why, right? Now, all of those things come back to learning, you know, and opportunities.
Curious, like, you know, I think you are in some ways the exception to this rule that, you know, I think you hear in the Valley and everywhere is just like focusing, right? Focus is super important. I have a lot of different projects, and me and Henrik have a lot of different projects. We love new things. I don't know if it's ADHD or it's just, you just love novelty, but like, it's always really easy to find new stuff, go after it. It's always exciting new, but following through and getting to like a deep level of expertise and like 10,000 hours or however you want to think about it is really hard, and becoming like really good at something is really hard. And so that's why you get this advice usually, both as a founder and as anything, is like, deep focus is important, focusing on one thing, becoming really good at it. And then that's where you like get innovation, because you understand an area so deeply that it becomes second nature to you. You sort of defy that a little bit, right? And your co-founders, and you defy that a little bit. How do you think about that?
I think it's a good question, but I'd kind of play this back to you and say we were nothing but focused on Go1, right? And I know this sounds stupid, but it's kind of like saying you can't run a startup or build a company and be in a relationship at the same time. Right? I don't think you guys would ever say to a founder, don't have a girlfriend, don't have a wife. You got to be focused on your company, right?
We wouldn't say that, but we do find that for the founders that are super focused and that's the only thing they do, it is hard for them to have a relationship.
It is incredibly hard. And that's what I'd come back to, is going, that pain is something for me to endure, not for the business to endure. That ability to find time for medicine should not be at the detriment of Go1, right? And so, you know, we like to joke and say that, you know, Go1 was all of our first children, right? Every founder now has 2 children. Go1 for all of us was our first child, right? And I like to say to people is going, that first child needs to be fed, clothed, looked after, nourished, and grow. And so our priority as a parent of that first child was to make sure that kid was growing and thriving. Everything else came second. But just because it comes second doesn't mean it shouldn't exist, right? So for me, medicine 100% came second, right? And I'm sure it's the same existed for Chris and Andrew as well in their individual pursuits. So you can still focus on something and have it as be your number one priority by a country mile. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't have a second or third priority. It's just being crystal clear that when push comes to shove, the first priority always wins. And in this case, when we were building and we were doing this, Go1 was my number one priority, right? I would have happily failed medicine if it meant that Go1 could succeed, if that makes sense. I
Yeah,
would have happily
totally.
skipped an exam, would have happily repeated a year, whatever it might be. But I think it's your tolerance. And Jensen Huang or Elon Musk, I forget which one talks about this, talks about a founder's tolerance for pain, which is incredibly important. I think to be a successful founder, it's got nothing to do with how smart you are. It has nothing to do with, how much of a subject matter expert you are in an area. I think a big chunk of it comes down to is how well can you endure pain? I think Elon described it as chewing glass and staring into the abyss. And I don't mean to be depressing about it, right? I mean to say it from the point of view is that the pain you endure is if you have a second priority there, for me, like doing a medical degree, it's your job to find the time to make it happen. But the priority is building your company, at least for me. Priority was Go1, and it always was, and it was always while I was doing that. And so as a result of that, medicine was something where I would have happily failed if it meant the success at Go1. But we'd still come back to, it doesn't have to,
Yeah.
right? How do you find ways to do it?
Cool.
The other side of for us as founders is that we're incredibly supportive of each other's way. Like, again, why do we set up a Johannesburg office? Why do we set up a London office? The other feeling is that, every single one of our pursuits enhanced what we're able to do, right? And I think that's important about finding that balance. And Mark, where I think we're very unique is not in our ability to cope with those things. I think where we're very, very unique is in the ability to have a team who had a mutual understanding that we were much better off making sure that we could all prioritize Go1 while having these second, third, or fourth priorities there and be fully understanding of how we support each other in doing it.
Yeah,
That's the luck.
It's pretty incredible. I think the founders that I do see that are sacrificing quite a lot, they're solo founders, right? I think when you have 4 co-founders and you're so aligned, I mean, that's sort of like really rare to find. It's a superpower. So that's really cool that you guys were able to achieve that.
Yeah. And then that's what I'm saying is I think that founder alignment and and I think, I'd love to say that it was just chemistry and it just worked, right? But like I said to you, before we went into Y Combinator, even after we went into Y Combinator, we had 10 years of dating as founders in building up a really not crappy, I shouldn't say crappy because it was great, but like building a pretty vanilla professional services company where we're building apps and websites for people. So I'll give you an example. When Salesforce came to Australia in about 2009, we had one of the first Salesforce implementation companies in Australia. So we were implementing Salesforce for all of Australia's largest companies, just purely as a professional services company, right? Now, we were making good money off the back of that. But I remember Andrew at the end of the day saying to us, going, it's not our business. It's not our product. We're highly reliant on someone else's product to be successful. And at the end of the day, if we look back on this in 10 years' time, which ironically is now, is it something we'd be proud of? And if I was sitting here talking to you, not that you'd have me on your podcast in this circumstance, and I say, Mark, Hendrik, we built Australia's largest Salesforce implementation company and partner. You guys would be sitting there going, cool, not much of an impact on the company. Sure, you make decent money, but that's about it. And so a big part of it, like I said right at the start, was around impact, around focusing on building something that we enjoyed doing and that had impact, and building applications for other people and implementing Salesforce implementations for other people was not necessarily something that we truly enjoyed, nor was it definitely something that was going to have impact like Go1 does today.
Makes sense. And when you talk about kind of pain or suffering, having the capacity to endure a lot of pain as a founder, oftentimes you see entrepreneurs being immigrants or having some kind of traumatic experience early in life, which basically raises their threshold of pain. Kind of the default kind of like threshold that you're able to endure is much higher for whatever reason. Immigrating to a country when you're young is a pretty traumatic experience. I'm an immigrant. I came to the U.S. when I was 9. And but there's other types of, I guess, traumatic experiences you can have. For you, what was that? Would you say, because it sounds like you grew up in a pretty good, loving household.
No, so Mark, to your point, I'm very lucky. I didn't have any of that. I was born here 10 years after my parents arrived in Australia. I wanted for nothing as a kid. My medical degree was virtually funded by my parents and my siblings who are 10, 12, and 14 years older than me. Like, man, I was spoiled as hell, all right? The one thing I was lucky to have is to be exposed to parents who worked their ass off. And so, I was talking to my wife and we have 2 kids and I want to spoil my kids, right? And you're gonna find it really hard for me not to spoil my kids. I said to my wife, I'm not going to not spoil my kids, but what I want them to do is see me get up every single day and go to work and work my ass off. A, because that's, I think, in my nature, but B, that's what I want them to see. I don't want them to do anything but to hopefully learn a good work ethic from me. Everything else they can figure out and, figure out their own way of the ninja of doing it. But for me, I'd love for them to be able to develop a great work ethic. That's the one thing I hope for my kids. And the best way I can do that is by being a role model like my dad, my mum were for me and work really hard. in terms of sort of going through pain and trauma that kind of gives you that resilience and that grit, I would say it's the 10 years prior to Y Combinator where we wandered the desert. So it wasn't one traumatic moment. It was 10 years of floundering in purgatory, trying to figure out who the hell you were and what you wanted to do and trying to balance all these different things at the same time. I would say to you, it's all of that. It was 10 years, like, to fund the growth of the business at one stage. And I tell this story quite a bit. I had about $250,000 of unsecured credit card debt as a 22-year-old, because when we were doing the pivot from professional services to online learning, we couldn't raise money. Like, there was no such thing as, like, I think Blackbird here in Australia had only just started, right? Or maybe it hadn't even started yet, right? So VC funds in Australia, at least, were not a well-known quantity. So as a result of that, because I had doctor in front of my name because I was an intern and resident at the time, I could go to a bank and get a $30,000 to $40,000 limit on my credit card. And so where some kids would collect Pokemon cards, we collected credit cards. We literally had like a baseball sort of sleeve where we'd put the credit cards once they were fully maxed out. So I would go to the bank, and Chris would do the same and Andrew would do the same. We'd go to the bank and we'd get a cash advance on $20,000 straight out. And that cash advance would instantly have 22.5% interest on it. And then we would instantly take that cash and walk it 40 meters down the road to our bank and put it in for payroll, right? So when you talk about pain and trauma, I think we went through a lot of it, but not in the deep personal sense, but in the founder sense of just, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear, but just eating shit, right?
That's right.
For 10 years. And then suddenly finding the promised land of what you want to do before you actually go through the valley of death as a startup and all that sort of stuff. So before we even got into the typical startup journey of, getting some traction, valley of death and the promised land, like, we had to go through what I call, going through wandering the abyss in the wilderness for 10 years before that. And so, Mark, to answer your question, I think we developed a lot of character through 10 years of not knowing who we were, what we were doing and what we wanted to do. I think we developed a lot of grit off the back of going through those challenges and troubles. And I think that there was a lot of blind ignorance. I think there's something to be said as a founder that one of the biggest weapons we have, yes, is a tolerance for pain, but two is sort of, blind faith or blissful ignorance, whatever you want to call it, right? I say to people, now that I've stepped back from Go1 for a while, people are going, well, would you restart another SaaS startup and move back into SaaS space? And my answer is, I wouldn't touch that shit with a 10-foot pole, right? You will not see me go back into SaaS anytime soon for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of the biggest reasons is, as being a founder in the SaaS space, I know where all the bodies are hidden. I know all the pain you have to go through. I know how challenging that space is. And again, I go back from that quote from Jensen Huang, where the guys from the Acquired podcast interviewed him. And they said, knowing everything you know now, Jensen, would you do it again? And his answer was no, because I know how painful it was, right?
Yeah.
Now, me going into other sectors like defense and health and all these other things, I know nothing about those fields. I've never built anything in those fields. So I get to leverage that weapon of being blissfully ignorant and running into this head first and going, oh shit, here's a problem. Now I got to figure it out. As opposed to, if you see, for me, if I see a SaaS startup, I'll see the next 40 problems over the next 10 years and be like, let's not bother. Doesn't mean that SaaS startups shouldn't do it. It just means I am definitely the wrong person to be involved in any way or form. And that's kind of the world that I'm in at the moment. So, long answer to your very brief question, Mark, I don't think there was any one traumatic event. I think it was 10 years of enduring uncertainty, which then builds that character.
And the real turning point, you said, was getting into YC in 2015. What was the Go1 idea like that you put into the application, and what was the experience like?
Like any good business, what we entered YC with is not the company that we were today, right? So we entered YC with the concept, and to rewind for you, there was this moment where Andrew called us all together. This is well before YC. And he said, we need to jettison the business we've spent the last 10 years building. But, well, you're an idiot. Why the hell would we do that? We've just spent our entire adult lives doing this. And he said, well, and he's all talking to all of us. He's like, well, 1, we don't love this. 2, we're highly reliant on other people's product. And 3, like I said to you before, there is no legacy we are building. We're incredibly smart, incredibly talented, and all of this energy is being wasted in implementing Salesforce and building applications and building websites for people, right? There's no legacy we are building. There's no impact we're having. I was in complete disagreement with Andrew of pivoting towards learning and building what Go1 is today. So it shows you how smart I am, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, at the time Andrew was the CEO, and it was, hey, we have a very hierarchical way of making decisions. The 4 of us will give each other our counsel, but ultimately the person, who is in charge makes the ultimate decision. And so we made that decision. And what we did was, I don't know if you remember, there was a TV show called Marie Kondo. I don't know if you remember it, where she goes to someone who hoards a whole bunch of crap in their house and they have to pick up the clothes or the box or whatever and say, does this bring me joy? And if not, throw it in the bin or give it away, right? So we literally Marie Kondoed our business that we had at the time and all the different things we were building. Web design, hosting, application development, Salesforce implementation, customization of apps, whatever it might be, all the professional services stuff, which today, sorry, the other thing that Andrew said is I don't know how, but in the future, everything we do is going to be commoditized. Dudes, this was like 12 years ago, right?
Wow.
So he could see where Squarespace and where AI was coming to play. Like he predicted Lovable before Lovable was a thing, right? And he's just saying, this is not going to be us. Like we're just going to be competing against computers, not even other people, not even cheap labor in the Philippines. We're going to be, they're just going to be able to, the apps will just do it themselves. So again, like this is credit to his vision and my lack of vision, because I was completely against this. I grudgingly went along with it. But ultimately what it really came back to is when we Marie Kondoed all the different things in our arsenal of things we had built, there was this one product which was around financial literacy training that we built for a local bank here called National Australia Bank, which is one of the largest banks in Australia. And it was about financial literacy training for lower socioeconomic people. It was called Start Counting. We charged 40 grand for it and we lost a bucket load of money building it. But it was the one project that we felt like had impacts, that could build legacy and that could scale, right? So we looked at that and we said, that is the thing. That is the thing that this all blows up in 10 years' time. We'd be really happy with the impact that had. And so we decided to pretty much divest everything we were doing, keep the learning bit, and focus on what was called a learning management system, or an LMS. And that is what we pitched to go into YC, only to find out that there were 700 other learning management systems in the world. And I don't know if you've read Blue Ocean Strategy, but we found out that it was a very much red ocean, right? Very quickly, we found out it was a red ocean. And that then forced us to pivot over time to really focus on content aggregation, which is what Go1 does today. So what we went into YC with was a stupid idea with a learning management system. And what we came out with several years after leaving YC was what Go1 is today. Now, I want to play back to you, Mark. What did YC do for us? What YC did for us is it raised our eye line, because we were getting one-on-one sessions with Peter Thiel, with the guys from Dropbox, the Collison brothers from Stripe, looking at the founders of Airbnb, being able to have these sessions with them. What it made us realize is that we're aiming too small as founders, that our peers at Y Combinator were Dropbox, Airbnb, Cruise, Stripe, all these amazing companies. And we deserve just as much to be there as they did when they were there. They were all there before us. And therefore, as a result of that, it was incumbent on us to be as big as they were, or to think as big as they did. And I think that's the challenge we sometimes find, or I find when I talk to startups here in Australia, you guys in New Zealand, like I talk to startups and I go, okay, cool. Sounds like a good lifestyle business. Do you intend to swing for the fences, or do you want to build a lifestyle business? And if you want to build a lifestyle business, sweet. I'm all for that, right? But I don't think venture capitalists are going to give you money for a lifestyle business.
Yeah.
And so the one takeaway from us with Y Combinator was nothing other than the fact that it lifted our eye line, lifted our ambition, made us understand that scale and global impact were a real opportunity and weren't just pie in the sky, but genuinely the opportunity that stood in front of us, regardless of what our product was, if that makes sense. And that was really important. That for me, changing your eye line is the biggest thing YC does for you, because you realize that, everyone else there is aiming for the same thing.
Yeah, I find that that's probably one of the most valuable things about the Valley, right? In general, not just YC, but the Valley, and just like meeting people who are building these businesses and companies, investing into them, and just realizing there's people like you and me, right? And like they have the same kinds of struggles, and they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like you do. And like you just see that and you talk to them and you realize like, well, like you give them a problem, maybe you say, have this problem. They brainstorm with you, and they would brainstorm maybe with you the same way you do with your co-founders. You're like, well, they don't have any special insight, right? They have maybe more experience. But like, I think that kind of leveling, and we found that we have some interesting kind of famous investors in our fund, and we brought them to New Zealand for a portfolio day. And we saw that like that sort of changed, I think, some founders' lives, like just being able to be in a room, talk to them, like interact with them just like you would just like with your friend, right? That just like tells you like, you can do this. There's nothing special about really anybody, right? Just like that empowerment.
Well, like I did a full day with 10 startups yesterday here in Queensland, right? And, I'm I'm pretty brutal with a lot of them, but I also caveat in that I've got no experience in your space. I don't know your space. I'm not a founder like I'm not you in your position. So I want a caveat of going, take what I say with a pinch of salt. But I will also challenge them in terms of whether I think what they can do can scale or not. Just challenge them to either think bigger or understand that there's going to be a limitation in what you do, right? Like I spoke to one company and I said, look, what are you targeting? They said, these 5,000 trained people in Australia. And I said, cool. How much are you going to charge them a month? They said $99 a month. Okay, cool. $1,200 a year. There's 5,000 of them. Your TAM is $6 million in Australia if you capture 100% of the TAM. And then they were like, yeah. And I said, well, great. So if you catch 100% of the TAM, you're going to make $6 million. And depending on what your margins are, at best, if you capture the entire industry, you're not going to be much of a business, right? And that was just my way of not discouraging them from attacking the business model, but understanding realistically where their metrics sit, what their approach is, and how they are potentially either going to increase their TAM or increase their ACV or both, a bit of both, right? And really rethink about their go-to-market, not just their go-to-market, but their whole product and their whole business strategy. Now, the reason why is not because I want to be an asshole, but because what I'm trying to do is not have great founders waste their time. Because I think one of the biggest challenges I find with the startup ecosystem, because Mark, I think you are right. There is a thing about, being visionary and trying to be around people who hustle. But you guys will both see this. You often see founders who I think are brilliant and wasting their time. I think they're incredibly smart, incredibly talented, but I think they're wasting their time. But that being said, you would also, there are a whole bunch of people who probably thought, Sam Altman was the president at YC when we were there at YC, right? So we got to know Sam well. And off the back of that, if you spoke to Sam, you'd know he's really, really smart. And he was doing all sorts of weird stuff like the WorldCoin stuff and, the OpenAI stuff. I don't think it kicked off by then. But it's just to say to you of going like, it's not our job to discourage founders, but I think it is our job to be honest with them as to what we think, but actually have that up to them as to how they reacted it. I take no offense when a founder looks at my advice and says, I disagree. I sit there and go, awesome. Now go prove me wrong, right? Like, I'd love for that company I spoke to yesterday to go out there and become $1 billion company and prove me wrong. I'd love that, right? But I think the worst thing I could do is not tell them what I think and give them my advice.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I mean, I think when I came to the Valley and I was building my own EdTech company, like I met James Currier. It's one of the people I met, and I met up to VenFX. And he told me that exact thing. He was like, hey, I don't think you should be doing hardware. Hardware is hard. It's not going to scale. Like, you're wasting your time. And I listened to him and I kind of just like thought, I think you're wrong. And I just like went and like, I did it. And the company's still around actually. It's 10 years in. The company still exists and still like creates products. And like, I think I understand, like, given my experience now as an investor, I understand what he's saying. And I personally would never invest into a company like that now that I know what I know, both on the EdTech and on the hardware side. But I think there's something to be said about kind of going through your own journey and learning kind of in your own way and understanding those things. Some things is just hard to know from a secondhand perspective. Like somebody tells you, like you tell that founder, this is a bad industry. Like they still need to go and really deeply understand themselves, right? And so for some people, like the way you understand it is through doing instead of just listening to others. Because I think
all founders should have a massive bias towards action. Because if not, you're a researcher, right? So as a founder, the difference between a founder and a researcher is a founder is actually putting it into practice and having a bias towards action. A researcher can look at the theory, but not necessarily look at the practice in terms of putting that into real world. What I would play back to you is that as founders, our bias towards action can often lead us into trouble, but also give us massive opportunities because there are so many things you do not understand until you've actually started doing it, right? Now, I think about sort of some of the challenges that founders run into on a daily basis. And one of those challenges we run into is the fact that we don't move fast enough. It's not that we're moving too quickly. A lot of them will turn around and say, we're moving too quickly and stuff is breaking and I'm not a good leader. I'm not good at managing things, yada, yada. It's like, no, because there's a part of your brain that is telling you to slow down. And that's the part that every single other person will be saying to you. And often if you're onto something that is unique, you're actually doing something that other people aren't doing. There's some alpha there as opposed to the market beta, right? And so at the end of the day, for me, I strongly believe that evolution occurs as a result of differentiation and adversity, not as a result of conformity and things staying exactly the same, right? World change, you've got 10 lizards in the, this is a crap example, but you got 10 lizards in the desert, climate changes, 9 of them die, but the one abnormal freakish one is suddenly adapted to survive with that changing climate, right? And that's what I'm trying to say to you is that I think there are 2 things that need to occur. One is adversity or some sort of big shift, and 2, contrarian thinking or a change in what it is. I remember 10 years ago reading 0 to 1, the Peter Thiel book, right? And I remember then, and I read it again. I didn't read it. I listened to it again on Spotify a week ago. If you have not read 0 to 1 in the last 5 years or in the last 12 months, listen to it again on Spotify and you'll be like, holy crap, he wrote this book 10 years ago. And 90% of it, you could say, yeah, okay, cool. He was on the money, right? And I think one of the things to think about is that you want to be, buying low and selling high, not buying high and selling as it dips, if you look at it from an investing point of view. So for me, where the alpha sits is in that sort of trying to look at the contrarian view in some circumstances, not contrarian for being sake of contrarian, but really understanding in what point are you thinking because you're conforming with everyone else is telling you, as opposed to being a unique founder and following your gut and your instincts, which have gotten you as far as where you are. I often tell this to founders. I often say to them, like, your instincts have gotten you to where you are. And when this board or these advisors are suddenly telling you to change, just remember they didn't get you to where you are, you did. And so as a result of that, there is a high chance that based on history, your gut instinct that got you to where you are today will get you to where you want to be tomorrow. And the answer is to probably follow your gut and accept the fact that you might be wrong. Because being wrong and blaming someone else because you followed their instructions isn't their fault. It's your fault for following their instructions and not following your instinct. And I think that's really important as well. Either way, you've got yourself to blame, but you'd rather blame yourself by following your own ideas than following someone else's.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And then so after YC, you came back to Australia, you scaled Go1, you raised quite a lot of money over the kind of 2019 to 2022. How did you find kind of running a company at scale versus, the kind of earlier scrappy times of starting something?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Officially I stepped back from Go1 a year ago, but unofficially I probably started stepping back about 3 years ago or so, right? And the reason I say that to you is that one thing I discovered is that I really am not made for the corporate world. I'm not made for a big structural organization. I'm the sort of person who kind of wants to have direct impact. Instead of being a general, give me a gun and send me right to the front, right? Like I prefer to sort of be at the coalface than be in the command center. And so as Go1 scaled, Hendrik, I can't give you too much of an insight, but what I'll say to you is that I really learned quickly what I was made for and not made for. And that was one of the biggest bits of growth for me as a founder. I think I'm a pretty good leader, but a terrible manager. And one of the things that as you grow and as you scale a business, you need to learn to manage, not just lead.
What's the difference between manager and leader?
In my eyes, I think a leader is more around trying to help people grow, help people achieve the outcomes you're looking for. I think manager is more around the accountability, not just the accountability, but the day-to-day management and trying to implement the strategy of how you're going to grow a business, right? Everything from I found myself at one stage trying to optimize a an opt to win ratio from 20 to 22%. And getting that 2% uplift would be tens of millions of dollars in ARR, except for the fact that I found that boring as batshit and not the thing that I love doing, which was going out there and pounding the pavement with customers and winning deals, right? So that's my understanding of myself. But we needed those sales operations capability. We needed that mature management structure. We needed those things in place. And I spent so long as a founder trying to figure out how do I make up for those weaknesses, make up for that lack of attention to detail, which needs to occur at that sort of level. And then I realized really quickly actually, I don't need to. Go1 is going to be successful with or without me. I have 3 amazing co-founders who are incredibly good at what they do. And if I'm there, the world keeps spinning. And if I'm not there, the world keeps spinning. And, that's where you realize that it becomes, and the most important thing for me is my fellow co-founders are still involved today, right? So it's not like we've handed our child over to a stranger to drive and run. And so one of the things that I would come back to for me is that it was more of a personal understanding that as a company scales, as a founder, you need to understand, are you able to transition? Are you able to grow your skill set to be part of this larger organization, to go from 4 founders to 100 people to 600 people to 800 people? That is a very different organization. But one thing I'll share with you is that I get asked by people going, as you scale a company, and Hendrik, I think part of what you eventually may ask is, how do you maintain culture, right, as you scale a company? And I'm going to preempt that question by saying to you, culture must change. So as a company evolves from a four good friends building a company to 50 staff to 100 staff to 1,000 staff, especially across many geographies, culture has to change. In fact, if I'm interviewing you, Hendrik, I'm not asking, how do you conform to my culture? Do you culturally fit into my business? I don't want that. I want to understand, Hendrik, Mark, how do you enhance my culture? How do you build my culture? How do you grow my culture, right? And that's something that's really important. So one of the things that I'll always say is that culture has to evolve. It has to change. Values don't. Values underpin the values we have today in Go1. And again, I've not been involved for a decent period of time in the company. But if I was to go to Germany and meet one of our team members who has just been hired last week, and I meet them, there is a high chance that that person shares the same values as me. Because as a founder, I've hired the person who 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 hired them. And I would hope that through that whole process, and I know that through that process, our decision to hire you, and to be frank, our decision to fire you, is not based on your capability, but also based on the values, right? And being highly capable is one of the values that we look at, right? And over time, we have rebranded our values so that it was easier to communicate to our team. But the underlying core values we have around being humble, hungry, honest, hardworking, making sure that we have a real focus on our customer, making sure that we understand that at the end of the day, learning is the core of what we do and the foundation, and having a passion for learning is important in the company. Those concepts have been rebranded several times over so that our team can understand it on a poster or an onboarding video or whatever it might be. But the core essence of those values has existed since the very first day, well before we started what Go1 is today, right? So culture changes, values don't. And so for me, as I went through this journey, as we scaled Go1 and grew Go1, what I came to understand is I love the company because of the values that we have. And as our culture evolved, I love the culture we were building. But for me personally, what I learned was I'm not made for a big company. Give me a 2-man team, a 10-man team, and I will work out how we scale that to 10, 50, $100 million. Give me a 200-man team. I have no idea, and I'll probably go backwards as a result. And so, it's a bit of a personal growth thing to understand that what I love is that early stage. That is home for me.
Right. And kudos to you to really discover that about you. I think a lot of founders don't realize that, they're made for the zero. And
Again, I didn't wake up overnight going, this is what I love, right? It took me time to learn, right? Like straight after this call, the reason I'm getting off the call with you early is I'm going to go see my psychologist. And I've seen my psychologist for years. She's known me for a very long time. And I don't see her because of trying to fix a mental problem or mental weakness. I see her because I want her to help me understand what I'm thinking and what I'm going through, right? And understand a bit more about myself. And, that's something that's been really important to me as we endure, Mark, as you said before, the trauma and the pain of being a founder. And for me, seeing my psychologist, who is completely objective and has nothing to do with my life outside of those four walls, I have the opportunity to really try and understand what's important to me. Where should I be spending my time, my energy, my effort? And I love that. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah. And a lot of therapy is around kind of, be getting a lot of clarity on your values, right? And I think that kind of came through when you talked about the company culture of Go1. But I want to talk about kind of your most recent 0 to 1 activity. So you said you kind of stepped back a little bit already, 2 or 3 years ago from Go1 and officially last year. Did you start thinking about defense, and take us through that journey? And then, would love to learn about what you're building right now.
So it's funny. So yesterday I was doing a talk at a health accelerator that I've been involved in for 6 or 7 years. And I presented a deck from 2019, 2018. And on that deck was talking about all the things you're worried about in the world. And one of the things that I put on that deck was World War III. So this was back in 2018. So I had my first child in 2019. And if you guys have kids, Mark, Hendrik, do you guys have kids at all?
Yeah.
Right, Mark, you do? Yeah. So
well,
for
I'm
me,
expecting one.
Everyone says this to you, Hendrik, and it's cliche, your life will change. And Mark, I'm sure you'll agree. Having my first child, I suddenly thought about the world that they would grow up in. I suddenly cared less about the world that I was living in and more about the world that they would grow up in. And Mark, I think you'll know that's the world you think about now.
Yeah.
And in 2018, 19, I remember thinking about it and looking at it going, where is the world going? And I think Crimea in 2018 had just occurred, and there's all this stuff that was kicking off. Taiwan was still a thing, and that made me really think
it was
of
a little
going,
bit earlier. It was 2014.
I think it's something like that. But I just remember looking at it going, there's just so much stuff that is going on all at the same time, and no one's talking about it. No one's thinking about it. I think Anduril was founded in 2017, like the year before, right? So Palmer Luckey doing the Anduril stuff. I just remember looking at it going, why is no one doing anything in this space? I have a really good friend who, Blake, who's my co-founder at Black Sky Industries. And he had Black Sky Aerospace, which we turned into Black Sky Industries, where he was doing rockets, and he's launched more rockets than anyone else in Australia. He understands rockets incredibly well. He always used to come down to Go1 after hours. I used to order a pizza, and we just sit there, and I just talk about his business. He was a founder with like 2 or 3 team members, flying rockets out in the middle of Australia. And I used to just sit there as a good friend and just walk through the business with him and check in, and we talk about it. And we did this for a very long time. And then it got to a point where I realized that I want to build something again. And, Go1 was going to be good with or without me. And I was really worried about this defense space and where, the world that my daughter was going to grow up in. And this was just, I know this is going to sound very tech bro-y. I'd read Ray Dalio's A Changing World Order. I think it literally came out that week.
Wow.
And Blake said, look, I'm thinking about focusing more on defense than just aerospace. And literally we shook hands and said, right, that's it. We're going to do it. That's it. That was it. Right. And didn't know where we're going to start. I'm not an engineer by trade. I'm not a defense person. Blake's a former Army pilot. Our other co-founder, Carl, who's been working with Blake up until that point, was a tankie. So both of them are former servicemen. They both run different businesses in the space. And we just said, we combine our powers. Can we build something in this space? And, it's the way any good startup starts. It was organic. It wasn't with purpose. It was organic. And then off the back of that, we really looked at pivoting his business. We like to say that he used to be 98% aerospace, 2% defense. Now he's 98% defense, 2% aerospace with a 2% margin of error, right? So we're pretty much a defense business. And what we focus on is something called solid rocket motors. Now, what solid rocket motors are is you have 2 types of motors in essence. You have liquid motors, which Rocket Lab and SpaceX will use because they can throttle them, reuse them, etc. And you have solid rocket motors, which are like just giant firecrackers. You light them, you can't throttle them, you can't put them out, they just fire. The thing about solid rocket motors is they're used heavily across defense because they're highly stable once you've made them, and you can transport them and store them very easily as opposed to a liquid motor, which is why almost every single missile you can think of is powered by a solid rocket motor. The challenge is globally, at least in the Western world, there are 2 major providers of solid rocket motors. It's a duopoly, Aerojet Rocketdyne and Northrop Grumman. Now, today, you don't have to be a genius to see the fact that the amount of money that is being spent on defense is insane. But the global primes, which are the large defense companies, their ability to cater for this demand will be impossible, right? Like they just don't have the ability to move fast enough to cater for this space. So our thesis is really simple. There will be a proliferation, and there already is started, but our thesis back then was there's going to be a proliferation of defense companies across the world, right? And you just have to open up the newspaper today, if anyone even reads the newspaper anymore, and see what's happening there. So, but more importantly for us, it's not about trying to capture opportunities or demand, right? At the end of the day, building a large successful company is actually going to be the byproduct of focusing on building something that Australia really needs, which is the ability to build defense capability, and the area that is most scary that no one wants to touch, which is lethality, which is missiles, right? So I say to people that I stepped back from Go1, I did my own version of Eat, Pray, Love and wandered the wilderness, and I ended up at guided weapons and missiles after leaving education technology, right? But the honest truth of it is the best way to be able to describe it to you is what we call the porcupine or the echidna strategy, right? If you think about the echidna or the porcupine, it doesn't have all those spikes on its back because it wants to go out and kill things. It has those spikes on its back so that when a predator looks at it, they might think twice before they want to have a bite, right? So that's why they call it defense, not offense, right? Australia is not looking to invade another country. Though New Zealand looks pretty good, probably not at this point in time, right? What's important is Australia needs the ability to defend itself. And I'm going to put it this way to you, Mark, who has a child, and Hendrik, who's expecting a child. I think that the chances of my kids who are 6 and 3 today picking up a gun in the next 20 years, not because they want to, because they want to join the army, but because they have to defend their country, it is higher in the next 20 years than it was in the last 20 years.
Well, I disagree with you. I think what you meant to say is the chance of them picking up a remote control to control an FPV drone.
Yes, exactly. Picking up an FPV drone, like controller to do that. You're 100% right. But the thing that it comes back to for me is that, and I sound crazy. I've been saying this for a number of years, and I sound less crazy, I think, each year as things progress. But I've been saying to people we are not moving fast enough. We are not prepared enough as a country or as an allied world. And I think the challenge, and I'm not trying to fearmonger, I'm just saying, you guys remember there was that Chinese ship that went between Australia and New Zealand back in February? I like to say it did a hot lap of Australia, right? They weren't whale watching, right? And the one thing people don't talk about is the fact that Chinese ship was a missile cruiser with about 112 vertical launch cells on board. Estimates, people will say, Australia has less than 100 guided weapons across its entire arsenal. That one Chinese ship doing a hot lap of Australia had more missiles on board it than probably the entire Australian army combined, right? And it's not to say the Chinese are the enemy. What I'm trying to say is that you just think about what intimidation factor that sits at in terms of being able to do a whole lap of your country with a Chinese missile cruiser, or doing live fire exercises 150 nautical miles off the coast of Sydney, right? And it's I shouldn't say this, but like as soon as that was on the news, the number of people who called me up and said, hey, you know, the defense stuff you're talking about, it might have legs.
Yeah.
I'm like, great.
Yeah,
It makes this ship being 150 nautical miles off our shore for people to be like, hey, maybe we should start talking about defense.
like for me, I guess I had a similar experience in February 2022, right? Like being in Germany and seeing the Ukraine war breaking out, suddenly, defense was a very real thing that you suddenly need, even as a pacifist country like Germany, right? And Mark,
Yes.
I can obviously talk about this even more because he is from Ukraine, right? How do you see Australians in general kind of react to that? Because moving here like a year ago, coming here and talking about defense with other people, it seems like Australians and Kiwis, they feel very far away from all of this, and they might not see the necessity as much as we do in Europe, for example.
Well, on the first front, and Mark, I'll put aside Europe just for a second, and Hendrik put aside Europe and just talk about the Pacific, right? We are the US's largest ally in the Pacific on so many fronts. So that's the first part that I'm going to put that aside, but just remember that, right? And when there was a trade war,
what do you mean by that? I mean, you mean in the South Pacific, or what do you mean? Because I think Japan's, bigger in a number of ways.
So in the Pacific, in this front, like we will have their bases, their resources. They'll deploy things in there, and just by sheer size of landmass, we'll have to defend. We are massive, right? So defending Japan, yes, but it's a smaller landmass than we have here in terms of physical space. The second part that it comes back to is that when there was a trade war between the US and China in 2017 or something like that, the casualty of that trade war was Penfolds wine, or Treasury Estate wines, Australian winemakers, and Australian rock lobsters. So when the Chinese wanted to, take a swipe at the US, they did so via Australia, right? And I'm just sharing that with you, not because I want to be provocative, but just to say to you that we are not, as a country as Australia, and I'm sure New Zealand's in the same boat, we're not immune to a battle between two great superpowers. And that's the first part that it comes back to. And Europe is a good example of going, well, what is the next step off the back of what's happening there at the moment? The other thing that I would strongly look at is just think about in terms of our preparedness and underinvestment in defense, right? Because the thing is, we've had a peace dividend since the fall of the Berlin Wall. We've had a peace dividend where we have been able to be the beneficiaries of it, where we haven't needed to invest in defense. And instead we could divert that money into building a better economy, better healthcare, better social infrastructure. But if you think of things as cyclical, the time to invest was probably years ago. If we think about, if we were smart, we would be saying, hey, if you see what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and you went to, the Ukrainians and said, tell me, what would you have done differently 5 years ago, knowing what you know now? And learn from what the Ukrainians would have done 5 years ago and start doing it now, just in case. There is a second part that I'll play back to you both, which is that I have a firm belief that Australia, at least, should be actually a net exporter of defense goods. We have the geopolitical stability, the resources, and the talent. That means the question should not be what percentage of GDP should we be spending on defense? The question should actually be what percentage of GDP should defense industry be contributing, right? And that for me is huge, because at the end of the day, in our space of building what we call energetics, things that blow up, the ability to build an energetics facility in South Korea or Japan where land is very scarce, let alone test them, is near on impossible. Here in Australia, what the one thing we have a lot of is land, right? And I think that's really, really important. Black Sky, we have 3 million acres as our test site in Western Queensland, right? And so that allows us to do things that other countries literally cannot do because they don't have the space to do it. So I just play that back to you both of going, I think if you look at what's happening in Europe, if you look at potentially what happens in the Pacific, the issue that we are neglecting, not just in Australia, but I think even in New Zealand, is we are neglecting the learnings that we could have taken and could have, we're just not acting with the urgency. And people will sit there and go, well, you're a beneficiary of that. And so they're going, I'll happily not be a beneficiary of it. Because, and sorry, Mark, if I can just add this, people are like, surely you want war to break out because, your company will just go through the roof. And I say to them, if war breaks out, my company makes no money because my company gets nationalized. It does not make a single dollar and it's needed to defend the country. So I don't want war to break out because if war does break out on several levels, my kids are probably screwed. But two, from a financial point of view, the company definitely doesn't make money. It becomes nationalized. as you would if you were in Ukraine, right? Like, so for me, what I would really come back down to is this is not about building a company that is going to make millions or billions of dollars. This is about making a company that's actually going to contribute to protecting the way of life that I want my kids to grow up in. I know it sounds very philosophical, but I could be building in any industry right now, especially healthcare, which I really love. And I say to people that I'm not in this space because I want to. I feel I'm in this space because I feel like I have to, which I know sounds very arrogant, but it's a genuine feeling that I have.
Well, I mean, I definitely. I was born in Ukraine. I have friends who are fighting the war, friends who are building companies that are supporting the war effort. So definitely understand very, very viscerally the importance of defense. But, I think for somebody who lives in Australia or New Zealand, it's not super obvious, right, to play devil's advocate. I mean, in either Australia or New Zealand, like the only wars they've been involved in were wars where they're sort of fighting early on on behalf of the British Empire, later on as part of allies in World War II, maybe allies in Iraq. I mean, it was always like it was never defending the homeland. It was always like sort of volunteering, going along with allies, right?
It's always expeditionary. It was never having to defend our homeland, right?
Yeah. So I mean, one would sort of pose the question here, like, yeah, sure, maybe the U.S., which is maybe seen as kind of belligerent, antagonistic to some people, they might get involved in a hot war. Although it's also hard to kind of see how that would happen. The U.S. is like pretty far away from both Russia and China. It's hard to see kind of like beyond obviously missiles, how someone would invade. But yeah, it's also hard to see that even more so for Australia and New Zealand, right? I mean, it's funny, like in New Zealand, especially, there's these like pillboxes all along the coast of the North Island because they built them for World War II, thinking Japanese would invade, and like Japanese never made it that far. It was just too far, right? Like, and yeah, sure, the Chinese can send like a ship down or two and just sort of like show off, but like practically speaking, like, I mean, they wouldn't gain much by sort of trying to destroy parts of Australia. So more on a more kind of practical level, right? What is sort of the argument that you would kind of
I think, and again, I don't want to pretend to say that I know anything about geopolitics, but if you're asking for my 2 cents, I genuinely don't think the Chinese want to stick a flag on top of the Sydney Opera House. I do not think that is the ambition, to have Chinese boots in the ground and suddenly we're all integrated into a Chinese way of life. I do not think that is the case, right? But like any good war, I say that jokingly, they're not necessarily like planned well in advance. It may be opportunistic. It may be situations where you have a domino effect where black swan events occur and you could not have picked it occurring. Where in hindsight, a Serbian gang leader assassinating Archduke Ferdinand in 1913 or whenever it was, resulting in the Axis powers having to pull together and the Allied powers pulling together and World War I suddenly occurring and suddenly leading to Gallipoli. I don't think anyone's going to put together those dominoes, looking forward and going, this is how the world's going to play out. I think it looks really easy to see in retrospect when you look at history. The challenge for me is that when you don't know how things play out, being prepared is the only thing you can really do. And I think that's, Mark, to what you're trying to say is, I do not think that we will end up in a global conflict, but I can still fear it. I can still be worried about it.
Ooh, I mean,
and I think we can still...
The devil's advocate to that point is actually that it was literally because of the rearmament that happened in the lead up to World War I and the arms race, where one country like Germany was building warships, Britain had to build warships, whatever the case was, that actually made war more likely, not less likely. The fact that you're rearming and you're thinking there's something to prepare for then makes you more trigger happy because you have weapons to deploy. That would be sort of the counter argument, right?
Yeah, I think the other side of it is also just underestimating or like, and again, I don't begin to say that I understand this, but I can imagine there is a calculus there of going, I'm only going to attack you if I think that I can beat you. I'm not going to attack you if I think I'm going to lose, right? There is that calculus, right? And that's what I'm just trying to say to you is that vulnerability really does mean that calculus does form in the favor of someone who may want to attack, right? Who may want to be aggressive, who may want to send a signal. And that's all I would come back to is how do you even out that equation such that that calculus becomes less easy to make in terms of that decision? Like, this is a really bad example, but I'd say that if Taiwan wasn't armed to the teeth right now, there's a chance that they're already a Chinese state. Like that's the argument that I would put out there. Yeah. I don't think that the fact that China has more weapons and Taiwan has a very strong military is going to be the cause of Taiwan getting invaded. Mm-hmm. But I have a feeling that Taiwan being armed to the teeth is one of the and the alliances that they have officially or unofficially with the rest of the Western world. Mm-hmm. potentially is one of the things that has deterred China from invading Taiwan up until today, if that makes
Yeah.
sense, right?
And I think the argument that you're making is the same that people made around the Cold War, right? It never became a hot war because there was a real possibility of nuclear war, right? So this nuclear deterrence was actually the reason for this long-lasting peace
Well,
since
and,
World War II.
people will say it's a stupid cliche of, deterrence through strength, right? Like, I do not think that diplomacy does not play a role. I think diplomacy plays the first role. Like I was saying to you with focuses as a founder, I think the number one focus should be on diplomacy and diplomatic means to be able to do things. It does not mean that you don't have a second focus on making sure that you have a means to defend yourself and you have a defense force. Because then the argument is going, well, why bother having a defense force at all? Like, why not just sell every battleship and tank and uniform and gun we have in the country if we don't think it's necessary, right? And the one thing I will say to you is that we recently had an election here in Australia, right? And both sides of politics in Australia had a position on building weapons in Australia. But the Greens Party, who are incredibly left-leaning and incredibly progressive, also had a policy on building weapons in Australia. The Greens, right? Now, I have full respect for those who vote for the Greens and for the Greens Party themselves. But what I'm trying to say to you is that even they had a policy on the importance of building missiles in Australia, right? And so what that tells me, and what I like about when you sort of step back and you zoom out and looking at elections and policies people put out, is generally politicians put out policies that they think the general public, it reflects what the general public is thinking. So in Australia, if the Labor, the Liberal and the Greens Party, all sides of politics, are putting out policies on the importance of manufacturing weapons in Australia, then it tells me that the reflection there, what I'm inferring from there, is the general public actually believe that as well. Because if you're a politician and you're a major party, you're not going to put forward policy that the average punter does not agree with, right?
Yep.
You're putting it forward because you think the average punter does. And the fact that every single party had a policy on manufacturing weapons onshore just tells you I guess for me, allows me to infer that the general public is actually quite supportive of it, right? That's what I think, at least anyway.
Woo, and war has changed pretty dramatically over the last 4 years, right? I mean, the capabilities that you see in Russia and Ukraine today did not exist even a year ago, right? It's like literally every single 12, 18 months, capabilities, the tactics, the tools and drones that are being used, battlefield are kind of being invented and used right away. And you saw that attack, I'm sure, of the Russian fleet, the Air Force being destroyed by small FPV drones. You're just seeing things that pretty novel, right? I'm just curious, when you think about it, I mean, to me, it feels like we're going to a world where it's just full autonomous systems being sort of remotely controlled by people that are sort of battling each other. And then once that happens, then it's like you declare that. I guess my question to you is what does war look like? What do you think war looks like in 10, 20 years, right? Is it just autonomous systems and these humanoid robots and drones, or is it, are there still people involved? Do we still have people getting killed? I mean, obviously it'd be much better if it wasn't, right? If it was just, you can just have a little computer like Ender's Game, a simulation. I'm sure you've read Ender's Game, right? Simulation on a computer, you play the video game and then all right, cool. You won, how do you think about that?
So I want to be really clear, and as you said, Mark, you've got friends who are in Ukraine. War is and will always be a terrible thing. The idea that war will not lead to people getting slaughtered and thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of people dying, I don't think that's going to ever be the case. As sad as it is for me to say that, that's the reality of it, right? Ukraine is producing 4.5 to 5 million drones a year right now. That's their run rate on drone production. Yet we have tens of thousands of young men dying on a regular basis. Drones will kill more people than any atomic or nuclear weapon ever will. And autonomy is just going to pour fuel on that fire. We're just discovering faster ways to kill more young men. That is all that it does, right? That's what these weapons are doing. It's not about drones knocking out drones. It's about drones knocking out drones to stop drones from killing people. And that's the challenge that I run into, is that war is a terrible thing, and ultimately it will result in the death of massive amounts of human beings. And that is not a good thing. That is a terrible thing. And I don't see technology changing that. All the technology will do is allow you to kill more people en masse, if that's what you're trying, if that's the intent of it. If the war is trying to achieve an outcome, until that outcome is achieved, you will just see massive amounts of people die. And the technology is just other ways. And so, I want to come back to it and going, I would love to see a world where they play a game of chess and whoever wins that game of chess wins the war. But unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. And the pawns that get slaughtered are tens of thousands of young men, usually, or people and innocent civilians. And it's a terrible thing.
But
Because remember I said,
why do you think we'll need people anywhere close to the front line? Like if you can have humanoids, you can have like
because
AI
once they cancel each other out, the next things that are left are people, right? Like, once it becomes a moot point, once they cancel each other out, what you're left is with people and kinetic effects. In other words, bombs, bullets, and missiles, right? And again, I come back to the fact that Ukraine is producing 5 million drones a year, and we are still seeing tens of thousands of young men getting slaughtered. And it's terrible. And that's the thing that scares the crap out of me in terms of what that happens. What does that look like in our world, in our country, for our kids, right? And again, it's like the likelihood of that is low, but it's not zero, right? And so the reason I want to play that back to you is I look at it and I go, war is an ugly thing that we never want to have happen. And I don't think it will ever be able to be reduced down to an algorithm. All those algorithms will do is allow you to kill more people more frequently at a much greater rate. I'm willing to say that drones have killed more human beings than any of the atomic weapons that were dropped on Japan. Someone can do the stats on that. But that, for me, is the terrifying part that it comes back to. The problem is that drones and autonomy, Pandora's box has been let out. It's no different to the machine gun being introduced to World War I, right? It's no different to gunpowder being introduced to war. So for me, it is inevitable that we can't put that genie back in the bottle. That's the hard part. As countries like Australia and New Zealand, my 2 cents is that we should be spending no money on building drones because we'll never be able to outproduce China or Russia, right? We should be focusing all our money on anti-drone technology, right? That's what it is, right? Like, be the turtle, right? Be like that's what it really comes back down to, right? Because the ability to outproduce someone like China, who is producing more drones than anyone else in the world by a country mile, is unlikely. And again, I'm thinking about the porcupine strategy, right? If you think about it, counter drone systems are used to defend yourself against drones, whereas attack drones are used to pretty much kill people and wipe out vehicles. And we're becoming so desensitized, I don't know about you guys, of seeing a drone run into a Russian or a Ukrainian tank or car and blowing it up. We're becoming so desensitized to it. Every time I see that, I go, that is young men in that car, regardless of what side of the war they're on, who have family members, who have mothers, who have fathers, sisters, or even children. And that, for me, it kills me every time I see that, of how desensitized we are to getting to that as people, right? We're looking at it as a computer game. And autonomy is going to even make that even more gamified. And so ultimately, it's kind of like this idea of young men die for what old men want to do. And I find that really, really tragic. So the reason why I'm saying this back to you is going, I don't know where this goes, except for the fact that it will be terrible and horrible. Because the outcome of war is always that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people, in particular young men, die. And that's a real shame. And I say that because when I grew up, the stories that I'd get my parents to tell me was when they fled Vietnam. But it was also the stories of when they lived in Vietnam. It was also the stories of what it was like living in a country where they were very deep South Vietnamese. So they felt they were living in an occupied land. They also grew up in a time where, when they were kids, was in the middle of the war. And, friends and family members would get shot and killed as bystanders, as collateral damage. And so those stories are really real for me because I'm one generation away from war, right? The problem is, am I also one generation away from war in the other direction with my kids? So that, for me, sorry to go very deep on that, but, my friends will tell you that war is something I'm terrified about, deeply, deeply terrified about. And it's nothing glorious or interesting or technically great. It is just a really shitty part of humanity that should not exist, but unfortunately it does. Sorry to kind of go off on a bit of a tangent on that, but crap,
well, I mean,
man.
I would give you some hope. I mean, I would look at history, and I think every war, historically, fewer and fewer people have, generally been killed. Like on average, sure, there's exceptions, but on average, it's been going in that direction where like you can get kind of
hugely. And that's what I'm hopeful. And if I can put this to you, Mark, there are 2 things that come into play there. One is the ability for nation states to cooperate, right? That's one part. 2 is economics and the fact that we are more globalized than ever before. So we can humanize each other, but we also at the same time, a war is a trade war as opposed to an actual war, right? A hot war. And I think the third thing is that people's appetite for war hopefully decreases. The problem is, at least for Australia and New Zealand, and I know that things have happened in the Middle East and we've had these expeditionary wars where we've had soldiers from Australia and New Zealand die overseas, but we haven't had to a point where every person in the country knows someone who has died as a result of war. And Mark, I think, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I'm sure you and your family members will easily know people who have died, right? And in fact, you can pick anyone in Ukraine and there's a chance they already know someone who's died, right? That they're only 1 or 2 degrees away from that. And that's a real challenge because therefore you understand the importance of this. But in Australia, we don't have that connection to defense. We don't have that connection to anyone who has served in the military, let alone died as a result of serving the country, because we're so many generations away. It's hard. It's challenging. But what I will say to you is that I'm also hopeful, Mark. Like I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought it was, unless I had hope, right? And that hope is that we can, do something about it. And we're a startup. We're a small team of 30 people, right? But it's better to start somewhere.
Do you think, to leave it on a hopeful note, I know you got to go, but to leave it on a hopeful note, do you think that AI can help us with this? AI can help us, whether it's align on differences or give AI control over our weapons, or?
I think AI will help, but I think AI won't help in the way that we're thinking. I think AI will help not in the terms of defense and building better weapons and better ways to fight and kill each other. I think AI will actually help in all the other roles in terms of our ability to actually look at the productivity uplift and the benefits to humanity of AI, and that we missed the boat on getting the most out of artificial intelligence and the role that automation can play in uplifting humanity in a global sense, rather than in the sense of building weapons of war and destruction, right? What do I mean by that? Well, the example I would give you is that, regardless of how you view it, we need, like, Taiwan produces these chips. The foundries are being built in Japan. Hundreds are super important for them to be able to build out these massive clusters throughout the Middle East and China and Australia and the US and wherever it might be. Like, I think it's more around the role that the internet will play, just like the internet played a massive role in globalization, right? And allowing people to cooperate more and all those sorts of things, and the financial benefit and the economic benefit that came from the internet in uplifting a whole bunch of economies around the world. I'm hoping that AI plays a role, but where I hope AI plays the biggest role is even potentially playing a role in uplifting emerging economies and actually helping them catch up. Because I think in that sort of sense, when everyone's got more to lose, they're less likely to pick a fight. And so what I'm hoping, this is a very bad analogy, but AI lifts human productivity and impact so much that the pie becomes so big and everyone owns a chunk of that pie, that their willingness to pick a fight is going to be stupid because there's so much more to lose, right? And so my hope is indirect when it comes to AI in terms of the non-military benefits that will prevent war, rather than the benefits of creating better machines that will kill people or blow things up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we know you have to go, so I want to wrap this up here. Thank you so much for joining us. I just also want to say, defense is not a sexy industry, but I think the fact that you choose to go into this industry, is really, really good. I'm excited to see what the company will be like in a few years. So thank you so much for doing this.
Boys, I really appreciate it. I appreciate the depth of the conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to also tell the story, because from my point of view, these long form discussions hopefully help, even if it's one person, understand that I'm trying to do this, and my co-founders and I are trying to do this for the right reasons, right? I like to come back to say we could be building in any space right now. We're choosing to build in this space because we think it's important, and we appreciate the opportunity for you to be able to, give us the chance to tell the story.
Yeah, I think it is important, Vu, and I think we'll see that over the coming years. And it's not easy, right? I think a lot of folks discount the industry and fear it. And I mean, you mentioned that it's, I think you mentioned on some other podcast that it's hard for you guys to open a bank account at one point. And so it's you're dealing with you're trying to kind of bring kind of the light to the world, right? Trying to make sure
sunlight is the best disinfectant, boys.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool, guys. Right. Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. Thank you.
Catch up soon.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to TechMates. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with friends. We'll be back soon with more stories of Kiwi and Aussie founders reshaping the future and disrupting down under. Until next time, keep dreaming big and daring to disrupt.